after Jeff Mosley's talk, Attacking Capitalism. By the way, when I was rung up by Hayden to give a talk, I said, Hayden, couldn't be bothered. You know, it's a complete waste of time at the moment. We're not going to make any changes until we get, as Paul Gilding would say, a Hitler walking into Poland moment. Those of the young people who haven't studied the Second World War probably maybe understand that people like Churchill were saying that Hitler should be contained, but the business community was saying, no, it'll be okay, he's got the trains running on time. And that one error resulted in about 60 million people losing their lives. It was interesting because it was only when Hitler eventually moved into Poland that the whole world was moved to do something. And I have a wonder whether we're going to be doing that. But what's pleasing is there seems to be some young people present. Do you mind putting up your hand if you're not too embarrassed? If you're under 30, you can put up your hand. Oh, that's fantastic. So it's probably worth me coming. Because all of the older people, I'm 70, it's a complete waste of time. First of all, we've benefited from the growth, and no one probably more than me in Australia. But it will be the young people, your children and your grandchildren, I think, that will suffer. Quickly, my background, I love bushworking, and I was only good in the Scouts. I was pretty hopeless at school. I did manage to get my leaving certificate, and I went to one lecture for electrical engineering at Sydney Uni and realised that there was no way I was going to get through that. So fortunately, in many ways, I decided to go back and work in the factory. In 1968, I started a business called Dixon Electronics with my young fiancée, who was 18 years of age. I put in $600, Pip put in $10. I always mention that in case we ever get divorced. Is that how it's divided up? Are there any legal people here? And look, the business that we thought we were starting was to fix car radios and repair manly cab radios, and have about 4 people working for us. I actually didn't like wealthy capitalists. My dad was a salesman, Mum was a homemaker, and very simple lifestyle, lived at East Roseville. Used to come home from school at 3 o'clock, and the only instruction was take off your school clothes and be back by nightfall. So we disappeared into the bush. They were wonderful times. Dixon Electronics did surprisingly well, and it expanded. I surrounded myself with capable people, asked advice, and in the end it started to grow, and I thought, well, I'll share all the money with my staff. And I had various bonus schemes, and gee, did I learn that some people are motivated by self-interest and capitalism and most people aren't. Because it worked very well for about 18 months when we were doing well, but then we had quite a downturn. And a number of my staff, when they didn't get the bonus, they'd actually gone out and bought cars on high purchase. So they said, are we going to leave? And I said, well, we're going to leave because they were valuable staff. Oh, well, you have enough money to pay us the bonus? And I said, I don't. I said, we're actually losing money at the moment. And it was amazing how I realised very quickly, they were then I lost 2 or 3 of my staff, others were totally demotivated. I sort of had the ability when times were tough to put on the act and to work really hard, whereas what happened to most of the other people working for me, it was the opposite. And it showed me then that there are different types of people, some people who are motivated by risk, and many people who would like to have a steady job where they're guaranteed employment, and I can understand both sides of it. Dixon Electronics expanded and did very well, and I sold it out at the age of, I was about 37 years of age, to Woolworths for over $25 million. And the number of people who said to me, Dick, you're irresponsible. I remember one of them saying, you could become a Rupert Murdoch. And Rupert Murdoch had just gone to the UK. The formula I had for Dixon Electronics by then was retailing electronics. By the way, it's a business that today does $1.7 billion turnover and makes $100 million or something. But I sold it out over 35 years ago. It's the best thing I ever did. Because I didn't want to become a Rupert Murdoch. I wanted to enjoy my family life, to go adventuring, fly around the world in a helicopter. And then I got involved in the Franklin campaign because I'd walked in Tasmania all my life. And the media made out that I was just there because I was there for the publicity. So I realised, look, I have to change my image, and I started Australian Geographic magazine, which once again expanded and got too big and had hundreds of staff, and I sold that to Fairfax because I really liked something that small. Not that I'd ever thought or had any queries in relation to capitalism and to the growth side of it. I'd never thought of it. I just thought, well, that's a particularly good system. In 1966, as a backpacker, I'd gone to Russia, and seeing what an incredible failure the Soviet system was, which surprised me because it sounded an ideal system where people all work cooperatively, as Jeff Mosley mentioned, we all get on together, and surely it would work. Well, it certainly didn't. Anyway, I had Australian Geographic until it got too big, and I sold that, as I mentioned, to Fairfax. And it wasn't so much after that. I started a company called Dick Smith Foods where we help Aussie farmers. And I realised, hold on, there's a problem in population. That one of the beautiful things about Australia was that we have a small population and a large country. But the whole business community was pushing for it to become a larger and larger population. And I became concerned, I think. See, we capitalists are pretty selfish, self-interest. I had a granddaughter, and I suddenly realised, gee, she's going to live to the end of this century, and with the present growth rates, it could be 100 million in Australia, and that didn't sound very sensible to me. And all capitalists have big egos. I thought, wow, in 100 years' time, or 95 years' time, in the case of my little daughter, Charlie Brown, she might say, oh, that Dick Smith, that grandfather of mine was supposed to be a person of influence. Why didn't he say something? And that's why I started to say something. And I, first of all, initially made some statements, made a documentary film which ran on the ABC, wrote a book with Simon Nash on population. But then I realised that wasn't the problem. The problem was our economic system that I benefited so much from. I made a fortune in electronics and publishing because the population went from about 7 million to 21 million in that time. Imagine the growth in population. You'd have to be a real dope not to do well in business. But I realised that a system which uses 1.5 times the world's resources every year was clearly not sustainable. And what I found fascinating was that I understood that the business community would be pushing growth because you analyse it. It's the shareholders, the mum and dads, many of you and many of your parents who have a pension fund or a superannuation fund. You're nodding in agreement. And they want their shares to increase in value, at least to keep up with the consumer price index. So there's constant pressure on every business person in Australia, especially if you run a public company, to have never-ending profit increases. And as you start to get to the limits of growth, which we're getting towards, the business people have to become ruthless. If you are the managing director of Coles or Woolworths, you've taken over just about everything you can take over. You're the biggest operator of poker machines in Australia. You sell alcohol. You do just about everything, and you've still got pressure to increase those profits all the time. Now, what's amazing is, I thought, well, I can understand that from the commercial media. But then I found out the greatest spruikers of growth is the ABC, which is supposed to be lefties. And I thought, this is really strange. And I watched this. I've written to the ABC often. I write to Tony Jones. And not so long ago, I saw on Q&A, you'll find never on Q&A do they ever discuss or doubt growth. And not so long ago on Q&A, they had a segment where the lady who runs the International Monetary Fund, can anyone remember her name?
Christine Lagarde.
Christine Lagarde. She was on, and I thought, wow, this will be fantastic, a chance to discuss growth. Because I know the International Monetary Fund are just the greatest spruikers of endless perpetual growth. And it was interesting, obviously before those at the ABC could control the agenda, two Twitter things appeared on the screen. The first one was, growth is not the solution, it's the problem, it's unsustainable. Then the next Twitter one was, growth is unsustainable and hopeless. Everyone knows that. And I thought, what a fantastic start. For the first time on the ABC, we're going to get a discussion of growth. No way. Once those two Twitters appeared, no one answered them. And of course, the Twitters don't get asked this question. There was not one question about growth at all. Quite interesting. Then the next mention, a while ago, I decided to launch the Wilberforce Award because I thought it's not old people like me that are going to have an influence on the fact you can't have perpetual growth, it's young people. So I decided I'd give $1 million of my hard-earned money to one young person in the world out of the 7 billion people, have to be under 30, so probably that'd be about 5 million people, seeing we've got such a young population, who became famous in communicating we can't have perpetual growth. And I thought, how can I get this launched and get coverage on the ABC? Then I remembered every time my friend Richard Branson comes to Australia, He's always covered. He might be opening Virgin Records or Virgin Airlines. He's always on the ABC. And I thought, I know what it is. He always has 4 beautiful blonde bombshells with him. Remember that? He's always there. So I said, I'm going to get 5 blonde bombshells, which I did. And they don't cost much. $150 for a couple of hours. These beautiful girls in little skimpy hot pants. And then I thought, might be a bit hard, so let's get $1 million out of the bank. Now, it's amazing. The banks don't have any money. Because when we went to get the money, we had to ring from bank to bank, and it took us about 2 weeks to arrange to get the $1 million. So we got it, and I got an old suitcase, and we put the $1 million in the suitcase, and we decided to launch the Wilberforce Award, the award that says you can't have perpetual growth, at the stock exchange. And so we were there, and you wouldn't believe it, no one from the media came, but the ABC came. Oh, I'm going to get coverage on the ABC. It must be the 5 blonde bombshells. But as I gave my presentation about the fact that the Wilberforce Award is for a young person to communicate that we need to live in balance, we need to live sustainably, which, by the way, the word's being used all the time, and I love the way politicians say sustainable population growth. There's no such thing. Sustainable, when I talk about it, means that in a given period, I like to say 12 months, we're going to replace what we've used. In other words, we're not going to leave the world worse off for any person a year later. That's what I call sustainable. Now, it was interesting, at the end of my presentation, and talking about the Wilberforce Award, the young ABC from ABC News journalist, capable young lady, probably about 25, 26, done journalism at one of the universities, and no doubt learned economics there. She asked me 3 questions, and each question was about racism. She said, this award must be tied up with racism. And I said, no. I said, this is a problem of the whole world. I said, the whole world basically requires on this perpetual growth, the Western world anyway. And I said, it's not sustainable. So then she asked me a second question, then a third question about racism. So I answered each time saying, no, it's nothing to do with racism. Well, off she went. Do you know what happened that night on television? Nothing. It wasn't showing. Because there, and this is what we're up against. If you've got the ABC, the mentality of everyone at the ABC, talk about a mob of dopes, is that if you query growth, if you query population, you must be racist, or you must be anything other than just a person with a bit of common sense. And that's what we're up against. When Q&A won't cover the growth issue, won't even mention it, and here I am at a university, an esteemed university, that all the time pushes growth. It teaches it in the economics department. I heard the joke before, or maybe it's a different one. The only 2 creatures that believe in perpetual growth are cancer cells, and they normally kill their host, and economists. And so what I'm amazed, I'm a car radio installer, I have no qualifications, but I have enough common sense to know that you have to live in balance. But here is an esteemed university. Your Vice-Chancellor is one of the greatest spruikers of perpetual growth. Does he know, for his grandchildren's sake, that it's not possible? Now, I disagree with Jeff Moser. I believe there's a very good chance we can have a form of capitalism, because it seems to work, but with a different form of growth. And this is the way I treat it. It's interesting. Capitalists do what's ever easiest within the law to make money. And most human beings are like that, I would imagine. And the human incentive of self-interest is very powerful. Yes, we have a cooperative gene too, which is very important, but certainly the self-interest one is there. And I think even when we were hunter-gatherers on the plains of Africa, I bet you'd find there'd be a certain amount of self-interest. So often did you end up with the chief or the leader, and you only have to look at the natural environment where that happens. Can we have a system where we allow self-interest to work, and the way capitalism has worked in the last, let's hope, few generations, is where you allow self-interest but you have strong controls, and then you cream off enough for the common good without taking too much of the incentive away from the greedy capitalist who's obviously got the ability to be able to generate the productivity. And it's all very well for us to criticise our material wealth, but it's certainly given us advantages. Jeff mentioned this idea of little village atmosphere, which very much copies what Ted Trainer believes. He doesn't actually tell us how you manufacture the airline aeroplane to travel around the world, because I'd say you'd need a huge, great big company, and you'd need a huge public company to do that, and you need cities and all the rest of it. It's the same with, I wonder if we'd want to go in this steady state economy and not have the fantastic medical equipment we have today. If you look at those scanning machines, they come from big globalised business. That's the only way. Might have been invented by someone at the CSIRO at Linfield, but the actual model we now have is because of large-scale business and globalisation. And I don't know if we necessarily want to step back. In the last 4 minutes, what I want to say is that I believe many years ago people thought that capitalism would completely destroy the environment. It hasn't quite yet, because democracies have brought in strong environmental laws. And one of the advantages of big business, which I'm basically against, but one of the advantages of big business is it tends to comply with laws. It's a little bloke will go and dump a truck of asbestos down the backyard of someone's house, but it's more difficult for a large company to do that because it has to be accountable. ICI out here at Botany Bay used to whack their chemicals into the Botany Bay. They don't do that anymore because there's very strong legislation. If the legislation complies to all business, the capitalism is so versatile in making a profit, it will work around it. And the waste is so staggering. So I believe that if we brought in laws that said you cannot, and it would have to come in over a period of time, not too quickly, you can't produce anything unless it's produced sustainably. And that means that every company has to be the same. So this apple, instead of being designed to last a year and be thrown out, in fact, you can only produce it if it's handed back in again, and the 5% improvements they get in efficiencies of productivity is the 5% waste you get in recycling it. Now, of course, there'd be an enormous problem because our system at the moment requires enormous waste to keep people employed. Up until the Second World War, the 3% productivity gains from capitalism roughly per year were used to reduce working hours. In the Second World War, we developed a measure called gross domestic product, which meant it was a wartime measure. And from that point on, because we've used GDP as the measure of our success, we have to make more stuff to keep people employed, because governments will be thrown out, company leaders will be thrown out, people will sell their shares if we don't have this continuous increase in profits and in the case of gross domestic product. And it's interesting, that's the way we keep people employed. So go into a typical shopping centre and half the stuff there is rubbish. You don't need it. But if we stop buying it, we'll have a recession, we'll have a depression. Our whole economic system will collapse. Now I can say, as a car radio installer, I have common sense. If our present form of capitalism is so successful, which it is to a certain degree, requiring enormous amounts of waste, imagine if you retune the system and you say the growth from now on is going to be in quality, not quantity. It's going to be in removing waste, inefficiencies. Every firm has the same rules and regulations. That would have to be coupled with a very major reduction in working hours to keep people employed. But a reduction in working hours at the same pay that you get for 35 hours, you'd get for 20 hours. Because that's the hours we should be working if we didn't have this unbelievable waste brought into the system of having to buy stuff that we don't really need. Thank you. I hope I've given you food for thought.